Waitress kisses millionaire in front of his family at a luxury restaurant. When he discovers the reason, he falls to his knees and thanks her in tears. The Lexington was perfection, in every sense of the word. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the room, illuminating polished marble floors and velvet-covered chairs that whispered luxury. The air carried the scent of aged wine and seared filet mignon, a signature of the restaurant's exclusivity. Every detail, from the immaculately folded napkins to the precisely aligned silverware, was a testament to Edward Sinclair's relentless pursuit of excellence. At the center of it all sat Edward himself, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored navy blue suit, a glass of Bordeaux in hand. The man exuded confidence, the kind that came from decades of building an empire, from crushing competitors without hesitation. Tonight was a celebration. Edward had just secured a multi-million-dollar contract, one that would solidify his position as the undisputed king of high-end dining. His guests, his family, and closest business partners clinked their glasses together, their faces plastered with smiles, whether out of genuine joy or sheer obligation. Standing discreetly beside the table was Stella Kensington, a waitress who had been working at the Lexington for only a few months. She wasn't particularly notable to Edward. To him, she was like every other employee, replaceable. But Stella wasn't serving drinks that night, out of mere duty. She was watching, observing, and then she saw it. Just moments before the toast, a shadow of movement, subtle but distinct, a waiter, one she didn't recognize, switching Edward's glass with another identical one. At first, she hesitated, thinking she might be imagining things. But then she saw the liquid inside the replaced glass, a barely noticeable shift in color, a faint difference in the reflection of the light. Something was off. A chill ran down Stella's spine, her pulse accelerated. She had seconds to decide, her hands clenched into fists as she fought the urge to scream across the restaurant. That would do nothing. By the time she explained, it would be too late. Edward would have already taken a sip, and if her instincts were right, she had to act now. With a deep breath, Stella lunged forward. A loud crash echoed through the dining hall as she tripped deliberately onto Edward's lap, sending the glass flying from his grip. A sharp gasp spread through the restaurant as deep red wine splattered across Edward's pristine suit, staining it like fresh blood. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Gasps turned into hushed murmurs. Businessmen exchanged confused glances, some horrified, some amused. Edward's family stiffened in their seats, their expressions shifting from shock to disgust. His mother, an elegant woman in pearls, covered her mouth in horror. And Edward? He stood slowly, wiping his hands with a dangerous slowness. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Stella, who was now sprawled at his feet, breathing heavily. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was low, controlled, but everyone knew Edward Sinclair was furious. Stella scrambled to her feet, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had no time for pleasantries, no time to soften the blow. She had to make him listen. "Mr. Sinclair," she whispered urgently, leaning in close enough that only he could hear. "I'm sorry, but I had to do it. Your wine was poisoned." Edward froze. For a brief second, his expression remained unchanged, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. But then his entire demeanor shifted, his body tensed, and something flashed behind his eyes, a mixture of confusion and something darker. "You're lying." His voice was sharp, yet not as certain as before. Stella shook her head. "I saw someone switch your glass. I don't know who they are, but who?" Edward cut her off, his voice dangerously low. Stella hesitated. She hadn't gotten a clear look at the waiter's face, but she remembered his uniform, his oddly stiff movements, the way he had disappeared right after the switch. Before she could answer, a commotion erupted at the far end of the restaurant. The security team had detained a waiter, the very same man Stella had noticed earlier. His uniform was slightly disheveled, his hands trembling. The moment their eyes met, he bolted, pushing past the guards and making a mad dash toward the kitchen. Edward didn't hesitate. "Get him!" he roared. Within seconds, his security team sprang into action, chasing after the man. The restaurant, once filled with quiet elegance, now descended into chaos. Edward turned back to Stella, his gaze burning with 1,000 unspoken questions. But there was one thing he knew for certain now. She wasn't lying. The wine had indeed been poisoned, and someone had just tried to kill him. The restaurant was no longer a sanctuary of refinement. The once smooth murmur of elite conversation had been replaced by gasps and frantic whispers. Security guards stormed through the dining hall, pursuing the suspect who had just bolted toward the kitchen. Some guests stood, trying to get a better look, while others, paralyzed by shock, remained seated, their eyes flickering between Edward and Stella. Edward's pulse pounded in his ears as he turned to Stella. There was something about the way she looked at him. Her expression wasn't one of guilt, but of urgency. His instincts told him that she wasn't lying, and yet the absurdity of it all made him hesitate. Poisoned wine? A last-minute interruption that just happened to save his life? It felt too convenient, too surreal. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her a step closer, his voice low but razor-sharp. If you're lying, you just made the worst mistake of your life." Stella flinched, but didn't back down. "I'm not lying. If I hadn't done something, you'd be dead right now." Before he could respond, one of his security guards returned, breathing heavily. The suspect escaped through the back entrance. "We have his face on camera, and we're already running it through our system." Edward exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He hated loose ends. He turned to his assistant, James, who had been standing nearby, horrified but silent. "Find out who that waiter was. I want his full name, where he came from, and why the hell he was in my restaurant." James nodded, fumbling for his phone as he stepped aside to make calls. The staff had started cleaning up the mess, but the evening was already ruined. Guests, shaken by the spectacle, whispered among themselves. Edward's business partners exchanged uneasy glances. His mother, still at the table, pressed a delicate hand to her temple, sighing dramatically. "Edward, this is unacceptable," she muttered. "A scandal like this? Not now," Edward snapped, his patience razor thin. His mother pursed her lips, but she knew better than to argue when he was like this. Instead, she gave Stella a lingering look, full of quiet disapproval, before turning away. Edward's attention snapped back to Stella. "You said you saw him switch my drink. Why didn't you just tell someone?" She clenched her fists. "I didn't have time. If I had run to security, you would have already taken a sip by the time they reacted." He hated that she was right. More than that, he hated that he had almost died tonight and never saw it coming. One of the waiters approached cautiously, holding a tray with the fallen wine glass. The liquid had been collected into a small container, likely for testing. "Mr. Sinclair," the waiter said carefully, "should we send this for analysis?" Edward barely looked at him. "Do it, and make it fast." James returned, his expression grim. "The waiter who ran his name isn't on our employee records. He wasn't on tonight's shift. He shouldn't have even been here." Edward's fingers curled into fists. Someone had infiltrated his restaurant, stood close enough to him to poison his drink, and walked around unnoticed. He turned to Stella again. "You've worked here for a few months, right?" She nodded. "Have you ever seen him before?" She hesitated. "No, but something about him felt off. I noticed the way he avoided eye contact, how he kept glancing at you. That's why I paid attention." Her words made his stomach tighten. How many times had he been in a room full of people, unaware of who was watching? James's phone buzzed, and he checked the screen before looking at Edward. "We have a problem." Edward exhaled slowly. "Of course we do." James lowered his voice. "The security footage was wiped from our system right after the suspect fled. Someone on the inside erased it." A tense silence stretched between them. Edward had built his business on control, and now in his own establishment, someone had outmaneuvered him. His gaze flickered back to Stella, her expression unreadable. She had risked her job, her safety, to stop him from drinking that wine. He didn't trust easily, but something told him that she wasn't the kind of person to be involved in this. "Stella," he said, his voice measured, "you work here, but I assume you have no personal reason to care whether I live or die." She crossed her arms. "That's an interesting way to thank me." His lips twitched in something that almost resembled amusement, but it was fleeting. "I want to know why you did it. You could have ignored it. It wasn't your problem." Stella hesitated before answering. "Because I don't think anyone deserves to die that way." She shifted, looking uncomfortable. "And because I've seen people in power get taken down without even realizing it was coming." Her words carried a weight that made Edward pause. There was something in her tone, something personal. He tucked that thought away for later. James spoke again, breaking the moment. "Edward, we need to decide what to do next. We can't let this slide." Edward already knew what needed to happen. He turned to his head of security. "Increased surveillance on every restaurant I own. I want every single employee vetted again. No more gaps." Then to James, "Find out how the footage got wiped. Someone on the inside is working against me." His gaze flickered back to Stella, the one person who had done something when it mattered most. "And as for you," he said, his voice softer but no less commanding, "I want you to tell me everything you remember, every detail. From the moment you noticed something was wrong." Stella hesitated, but then nodded. "All right." For the first time in years, Edward felt something unfamiliar vulnerability. Someone had just tried to kill him, and he hadn't seen it coming. But he wasn't going to sit back and wait for another attempt. He was going to find out who was behind this, and when he did, they would regret ever thinking they could take him down. The Lexington was quiet now, almost unnervingly so. The once bustling restaurant had emptied out, leaving only the lingering scent of spilled wine and expensive cologne in the air. Staff members moved cautiously, cleaning up the aftermath of the chaos while stealing wary glances toward Edward. No one dared speak to him, unless absolutely necessary. The weight of the night's event still hung thick over everything. Edward sat at a private table in a secluded section of the restaurant, his fingers tapping against the polished wood as he watched his security team work. They had managed to track down the discarded uniform the suspect had used, left behind in a service corridor near the back exit. It had no name tag, no indication of where it had come from. Whoever this man was, he had walked in with a plan and disappeared like smoke. The lab results on the wine had come back faster than expected. Ed, the security chief, a man named Carter, placed the printed report on the table in front of Edward, his expression tense. "It was poison, sir. The compound is a synthetic neurotoxin, odorless, tasteless, undetectable in liquid unless specifically tested for. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Edward picked up the report, scanning the words carefully. He didn't need to be a scientist to understand the bottom line. If he had taken even a sip of that wine, he would have been dead in minutes. The poison would have shut down his nervous system, his organs collapsing one by one, until he suffocated from within. His jaw tightened as he set the report back down. "So we're dealing with professionals?" Carter nodded. "Yes, sir. This wasn't an amateur attempt. This was calculated." Edward exhaled through his nose, his mind already working through possibilities. His list of enemies wasn't short. Being in his position came with its fair share of people who wanted him ruined. But outright murder? That was a different level of intent. James entered the private section, his face grim as he checked his phone. "We've started an internal review of all employees. Nothing unusual so far, but I'm guessing whoever wiped the security footage covered their tracks well. If there's a mole, they're not making it easy to find them." Edward's patience was running thin. He didn't tolerate loose ends, and right now his business had a gaping wound in its security. He leaned forward, rubbing his temples for a brief moment before glancing at Stella, who was sitting quietly across from him. She hadn't left since the incident. He hadn't let her not because he thought she was involved. If anything, she was the only person who had actively prevented his death. But there were still too many unanswered questions, and Edward Sinclair didn't like uncertainties. Stella shifted under his gaze, clearly uncomfortable. She had been staring at the floor for a while, letting the weight of the night settle in. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady but guarded. "What now?" Edward studied her carefully. She was still in her uniform, though it was slightly disheveled from the chaos. Her eyes, though tired, remained sharp. There was something about her, something that didn't fit the mold of a simple waitress. "You tell me," he said. "You noticed the switch when no one else did. That means you're either incredibly observant, or you had a reason to be watching me that closely." Stella's jaw tightened. "You think I had something to do with this? If I thought that, you wouldn't still be sitting here." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "I don't know what else to tell you." The guy felt off. "I noticed it, and the second I saw him switch your glass, I knew something was wrong." Edward leaned back in his chair, considering her words. She wasn't lying, but that didn't mean she wasn't hiding something. Carter cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may, Miss Kensington's actions were reckless, but they saved your life. If she hadn't done what she did, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now." Edward nodded slowly. "I know." Silence stretched between them for a moment before he spoke again. "You're sure you've never seen him before?" Stella hesitated, and for the first time, there was something flickering behind her eyes, something unreadable. "No." But Edward's fingers drummed against the table. "But what?" She swallowed hard. There was something familiar about him, not his face, but the way he carried himself, the way he moved. Edward narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Stella let out a slow breath. "I don't know how to describe it." He walked like he was always aware of his surroundings, like he was trained for something more than just waiting tables. James exchanged a glance with Carter. "Military, possibly," Carter murmured, "or at least someone with professional combat training." Edward didn't like where this was going. If the man who had tried to kill him wasn't just some hired thug, but someone with real experience, that meant whoever had ordered the hit wasn't just reckless, they were resourceful. His gaze snapped back to Stella. "And you just happened to recognize that?" Stella's expression remained unreadable. "I noticed things." Edward wasn't sure what to make of her yet, but he had a feeling she wasn't just a simple waitress. There was more to her than met the eye, but for now, he had bigger problems. He stood, straightening his suit. "Find out who hired that man," he ordered Carter. "If he was a professional, someone paid him. I want names." James nodded. "Understood." Edward turned back to Stella. "And you're staying close." She frowned. "What?" "You saved my life, which means you're now a loose end in whoever's plan this was. That makes you a target." Stella blinked, as if the reality of the situation had just sunk in. "So what? I just drop my life and stay by your side?" Edward smirked, though there was no amusement in his eyes. "No. You go back to work and act normal, but you don't go anywhere alone, not until I know who did this and why." Stella stared at him, as if debating whether to argue, but deep down, she knew he was right. Someone had tried to assassinate him, and now she was part of the mess. She exhaled sharply. "Fine, but I don't take orders from you." Edward chuckled, low and dark. "You will if you want to stay alive." Stella rolled her eyes but said nothing as she stood up to leave. Edward watched her carefully. She was an enigma, one that he intended to solve, but first, he had a traitor to hunt down, and when he did, there would be no mercy. Edward had always been a man who controlled his world with precision. He had built his empire with ruthless efficiency, cutting out weakness wherever he found it. But tonight, sitting in his office overlooking the city skyline, he felt something unfamiliar, creeping in vulnerability. Someone had tried to kill him in his own restaurant, under his nose, and he had never seen it coming. He exhaled sharply, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. The burn, as it slid down his throat, did nothing to quiet the rage simmering beneath the surface. His hands tightened around the glass as he replayed the night's events over and over, trying to find the moment when he had lost control. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. James stepped inside, his face set in a grim expression. "We have a lead," he said. Edward straightened, setting his glass down. "Go on." James handed him a file. "The man who poisoned your drink, his name is Alex Mercer. Ex-military, served in a specialized unit before being dishonorably discharged 5 years ago. Since then, he's been off the grid. No employment records, no addresses. He's a ghost." Edward flipped through the file, taking in the details. Someone hired him. Someone with money and connections. James nodded. "And that's not the worst part." He hesitated before continuing. "We traced a recent wire transfer to an offshore account linked to Mercer. The money came from a shell company." Edward's jaw clenched. "Whose company?" James met his gaze, his voice cold. "Patrick Sinclair." Edward felt the impact like a punch to the gut. He had known for years that his brother resented him, that Patrick had always been envious of his power, his control. But hiring someone to kill him? That was something else entirely. He threw the file onto his desk, his expression unreadable. "Where is he?" James sighed. "At his penthouse, acting like nothing happened." Of course he was. Patrick had always been good at pretending. Edward grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "Tell security to stand by. I want Mercer found, and I want to have a word with my dear brother." The drive to Patrick's residence was silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as Edward's mind worked through the betrayal. They had never been close. Their relationship had always been one of competition, of Patrick constantly trying to prove himself against his older brother. Patrick had been reckless his entire life, spending money he didn't have, making deals he couldn't back up, expecting Edward to clean up his messes. But this time, he had crossed a line. When the car pulled up in front of Patrick's luxury building, Edward didn't wait for permission. He stepped out and walked past security, his presence alone enough to make them hesitate. No one dared to stop him. He found Patrick in his living room, lounging with a drink in hand, smirking like he hadn't just been caught trying to orchestrate his brother's murder. Well, Patrick said, swirling his whiskey. To what do I owe the pleasure? Edward didn't bother with pleasantries. He strode forward, grabbed Patrick by the collar, and slammed him against the wall. The glass fell from Patrick's hand, shattering on the floor. What the hell, Edward? Patrick gasped, struggling against his grip. Edward's voice was low, controlled, but filled with fury. You tried to have me killed. Patrick's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, but there was a nervous edge to it now. I have no idea what you're talking about. Edward tightened his grip. I have proof, Patrick. I know about Mercer. I know about the money you sent him. You really thought you'd get away with it? Patrick laughed, though it sounded forced. Edward, let's be rational here. Why the hell would I want you dead? Edward slammed him harder against the wall. Because you found out I was cutting you off. Because you can't stand the fact that you'll never be more than a second-rate leech. Patrick's eyes darkened. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? Edward leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I am better than you. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Patrick smiled, a slow, venomous smile. You're right, he said. I did it. Edward's expression didn't change, but inside, something twisted. Patrick continued, his tone taunting. Do you have any idea how long I've waited for this? Watching you stand on your damn throne, acting like you own the world while I get the scraps? I was supposed to be the one in charge, but Dad always favored you, didn't he? Edward's eyes flashed. You brought this on yourself, Patrick chuckled. Maybe, but let me ask you something. Big brother, what are you going to do about it? Edward stared at him for a long moment before finally letting him go, shoving Patrick back. He could have had him arrested right then and there. He could have ended it, but that would have been too easy. Instead, he straightened his suit and stepped back. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Patrick smirked, rubbing his collar. We'll see about that. Edward turned and walked out, his mind already working through his next move. This wasn't over, not even close. As he stepped into the car, his phone buzzed. It was James. We found Mercer. Edward's grip tightened on his phone. Where? James hesitated. He's dead. Edward felt his pulse quicken. What? Someone got to him before we did. This wasn't a loose end tied up. This was a message. Edward exhaled slowly, his jaw clenching. Someone else was involved in this, someone even bigger than Patrick. And now it wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. The city stretched out beneath him, a sea of flickering lights, oblivious to the war brewing in the shadows. Edward stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, whiskey in hand, the weight of the night pressing down on him like an iron fist. He had walked into Patrick's penthouse, expecting a coward's denial. Instead, his brother had admitted to the attempted murder as if it were nothing more than a game, a twisted power move in a rivalry that had gone far beyond simple resentment. And now, Mercer was dead. Someone had cleaned up the mess before Edward could get to him. That meant there was another player in the game, someone who wanted to keep their involvement buried. He had no doubt Patrick was involved, but his brother had never been smart enough to orchestrate something this precise on his own. No, someone else was pulling the strings. His fingers tightened around the glass. He had spent years building an empire where control was absolute, where every piece on the board moved because he allowed it. Now someone had flipped the table, and that was unacceptable. James's voice broke through his thoughts, steady but laced with tension. We got more details from Carter. Mercer's body was found in an alley downtown. 2 bullets to the chest. Clean job. No ID, no phone, no wallet. Whoever did this didn't just want him dead. They wanted him erased. Edward turned, his gaze sharp. That means whoever hired him thought he was a liability. James nodded. Exactly. Mercer was a loose end, and someone tied it up before we could pull the thread. Edward took a slow sip of his drink, his mind working through the possibilities. That also means there's someone else out there who knows the full extent of this plot. He set the glass down. Did forensics find anything? James exhaled. Nothing. No fingerprints, no security footage. Whoever did this was a professional. Edward wasn't surprised. A sloppy assassin wouldn't have lasted this long. Patrick's working with someone. Find out who. James hesitated. And what about Patrick? Edward's jaw tightened. His brother was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He knew Edward wouldn't let this go. For now, we watch him. He just admitted to trying to kill me. and I let him walk away. That's going to eat at him. He'll make a mistake. A knock at the door pulled both men's attention. Carter stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Sir, there's something you need to see." Edward and James exchanged a glance before following Carter out of the penthouse. They rode the elevator down in silence, the hum of the city barely reaching them. When the door slid open to the lobby, Carter led them to a side entrance where one of Edward's security team members was waiting. The man gestured to a black envelope resting on a sleek silver tray. Edward's gut twisted. He didn't like surprises. Carter handed him a pair of gloves. "No prints on the envelope. We scanned it for explosives, nothing. But something tells me you're going to want to read it." Edward took the envelope carefully, his fingers steady, despite the storm brewing inside him. He slid out the crisp white card inside and read the words written in elegant, deliberate handwriting. "This isn't over. Stay out of matters you don't understand." No signature, no indication of who had sent it, just a clear, unmistakable warning. James peered over his shoulder, his expression darkening. "So we're dealing with people who send dramatic threats now?" Edward folded the card, sliding it back into the envelope. This wasn't for theatrics. This was a message. Carter's voice was low. "Whoever they are, they're watching." Edward already knew that. Someone had calculated every move, covering their tracks at every turn. They had anticipated his reaction, cleaned up their mess, and now they were warning him to walk away. But Edward Sinclair didn't walk away. He crushed the envelope in his fist, his voice cold and sharp. "Double the security at every restaurant, every property, every asset I own. If they're watching, let's give them something to see." Carter nodded, already making calls. James leaned in slightly. "You think Patrick sent this?" Edward shook his head. "No. Patrick's a child. If he wanted to send a message, he'd do it with a tantrum, not with precision." James exhaled slowly. "Then whoever sent this isn't just cleaning up Patrick's mess. They're controlling the game." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. Not for long. They returned to the penthouse, but Edward couldn't shake the feeling that the walls had eyes. He had spent his life being the one in control, the one pulling the strings. Now, for the first time, someone else had made a move before him, and that was something he wouldn't tolerate. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're asking the wrong questions." Edward's grip tightened around the device, his patience gone. "Trace this," he ordered James. James didn't hesitate, already working on it. Edward poured another drink, but this time he wasn't trying to calm himself. He was waiting for whoever was playing this game to make their next move, because when they did, he'd be ready. And he wouldn't just fight back, he'd win. Edward had never been a man to act on impulse. Every move he made was calculated, precise, designed to put him one step ahead of his competition. But this was different. Someone had made the first move against him. Someone had taken a shot and nearly succeeded. Now the rules had changed. James worked silently beside him, fingers flying across the keyboard as he tried to trace the number that had sent the cryptic message. The screen flashed with lines of code, bouncing between proxies and scrambled locations. Whoever had sent the text knew what they were doing. "No luck," James muttered. "Whoever this is," they covered their tracks. Edward exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "Keep working on it. No one's untouchable." Carter entered the office, his stance rigid. "We've tightened security across all locations. No unusual activity so far, but we're keeping a close eye." Edward nodded, his mind already moving past the basics. The enemy wasn't some amateur who could be scared off by extra security. This wasn't just about his survival anymore. This was about control, and someone had just challenged his control. His phone buzzed again, another unknown number, another message. "You're wasting time. The enemy isn't where you're looking." Edward's grip tightened around the device. His eyes flicked to James, who had already seen the message. "This guy's taunting us," James said. "They know we're trying to trace them." Edward wasn't interested in games. If someone wanted to play with him, they'd lose. He looked at Carter, who had access to Patrick's financials before the wire transferred to Mercer. Carter hesitated for a moment. His assistant, of course. His financial team. But Patrick's reckless. He's got people in his ear all the time. If someone nudged him toward hiring Mercer, it wouldn't have taken much. Edward's jaw clenched. He had been so focused on Patrick, so certain that his brother had acted alone, that he hadn't considered another possibility. What if Patrick had been nothing more than a pawn? He turned back to James. Get me everything on Patrick's recent meetings, calls, interactions, especially anyone who's been pushing him in a certain direction." James nodded, already working. The silence stretched between them for a long moment, the weight of it settling heavily on Edward's shoulders. Then Carter's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. "We have a problem." Edward's patience snapped. "What now?" Carter's voice was grim. "One of our restaurant managers just disappeared." Edward stilled. "Which one?" "The Lexington. His name's Roger Mills. He left after closing up, never made it home. His phone's off, his car's still in the parking garage." Edward's blood ran cold. The Lexington, the very place where someone had tried to kill him, and now one of his own people had vanished. He stood, already moving. Find him. Carter was one step ahead, already making calls as he followed Edward and James to the car. The drive to the restaurant was silent, tension thick in the air. Edward's mind was sharp, focused. Whoever had taken Roger Mills hadn't done it randomly. This was a message, and he was starting to get real tired of people sending him messages. When they pulled into the garage beneath the Lexington, the place was deserted. Security lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the empty rows of parked cars. Edward stepped out first, scanning the area. Carter's men were already moving, sweeping the space for any sign of Mills. Then, just as Carter reached for his radio, something caught Edward's eye. A figure slumped against the wall near the stairwell. Mills. Edward crossed the distance in seconds, kneeling beside the man. His clothes were wrinkled, his face bruised, but he was alive. Mills let out a pained groan, blinking up at him. "Mr. Sinclair." Edward's voice was calm but sharp as a knife. "Who did this?" Mills tried to sit up, wincing. I don't know. They grabbed me, said I needed to deliver a message." Edward's stomach tightened. "What message?" Mills swallowed hard. "They said stay out of the way, or next time it won't be a warning." James cursed under his breath. Carter looked ready to put a hole through a wall. Edward's expression didn't change. He had expected retaliation, but not like this. This wasn't just about taking him out anymore. This was about control, fear. They wanted him to feel vulnerable. Big mistake. Edward stood, adjusting his cuffs. "Take Mills to the hospital. I want security on him 24/7." Carter nodded, already issuing orders. Edward turned to James. "Whoever's behind this just made a critical error." James raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Edward's voice was icy cold. "They just told me exactly how afraid they are. Because only desperate people left warnings. Only weak people tried to intimidate their prey instead of eliminating it outright." And now that Edward knew his enemy wasn't as invincible as they wanted him to believe, he was going to hunt them down, no matter what it took. Edward had always believed that control was everything. It was the foundation of his empire, the reason he had built his businesses into an untouchable force. But now someone was trying to rip that control from his hands piece by piece. First, they had tried to kill him. Then they had eliminated Mercer before he could talk. Now they had gone after Roger Mills, a direct warning meant to rattle him. But Edward Sinclair didn't rattle. He calculated. As the car pulled up in front of his headquarters, he was already forming his next move. James and Carter followed closely behind as he strode into the building, his mind running through every possibility. They took the private elevator up to his office. The moment the doors opened, Edward was met by the sharp scent of fresh coffee and the sound of his assistant, Julia, standing by his desk, waiting for him. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Edward's brow furrowed. "Who?" Before she could answer, the answer walked into the room. Richard Davenport. The moment Edward laid eyes on him, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Davenport was one of his business partners, at least. He had been before. Edward started distancing himself from him. He had always been ruthless, always looking for ways to gain an advantage, but he had never been bold enough to cross him. Until now. Edward walked to his desk, taking his time as he settled into his chair. He gestured toward the seat across from him. Richard Davenport smirked. "Edward, it's been a while." Edward didn't return the smile. "You must be feeling confident, walking in here like this." Davenport chuckled, unbuttoning his expensive suit jacket as he sat. "Oh, come on. No need for hostility. I just came to talk." James and Carter took their places behind Edward, silent but watchful. Edward leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Go ahead. Talk." Davenport exhaled, feigning disappointment. You always were straight to the point. Fine. Let's stop pretending. His smirk widened. You've been asking the wrong questions, Edward. Edward's expression didn't change, but inside, his instincts sharpened. Davenport leaned in slightly. Patrick was never the real problem. He's just a spoiled brat who hates you. But he didn't come up with this on his own. He needed guidance, someone to give him the right push. Edward's patience thinned. You? Davenport shrugged. You cut me out, Edward. You thought you could push me aside and keep all the power for yourself. He shook his head. That was a mistake. Edward exhaled slowly, his voice ice cold. So you convinced my idiot brother to have me killed. Davenport chuckled. Patrick didn't take much convincing. He already hated you. I just gave him the tools. Edward nodded, absorbing the confession. And Mercer? You had him killed? Davenport tilted his head. Loose ends don't fit well in my plans. You understand. Edward's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. He understood perfectly. This wasn't just about some petty attempt at revenge. Davenport had seen an opportunity with Edward out of the picture. Patrick would have taken over, and Patrick was easy to manipulate. Edward leaned back, exhaling sharply. And the warning, Roger Mills, was that you too? Davenport smiled. Consider it encouragement. You're a smart man, Edward. You know when the odds aren't in your favor. Edward chuckled, shaking his head. You think I'm just going to back down? Davenport's smirk faded slightly. I think you're outnumbered. You've been so busy focusing on your empire that you forgot something important. His voice lowered. There are people who want to see you fall. Edward studied him for a long moment before speaking. And you came here because you think I'll negotiate? Davenport's smirk returned. I came here to give you a choice. He spread his hands. You step down, walk away, hand the company over to Patrick, retire somewhere, live a long, quiet life. Edward waited for the or. Davenport's smirk darkened. Or you keep fighting, and one day you won't see it coming. The office was silent, the tension thick. Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. That's your offer? Davenport shrugged. You're a businessman. You know how to recognize a losing battle. Edward stood, straightening his suit. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from Davenport. You think I'm afraid of you? Davenport's confidence flickered, but he recovered quickly. I think you should be. Edward smiled. A slow, dangerous smile. No, Richard. I think you should be afraid of me. Davenport's smirk finally faltered. Edward leaned in slightly. You just made your biggest mistake. Davenport exhaled, standing as well. We'll see. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. James and Carter were already moving, but Edward held up a hand. Let him go, he said. James frowned. Edward, he just admitted. I know what he admitted, Edward interrupted. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with something cold and lethal. Carter crossed his arms. So what's the play? Edward exhaled. Davenport isn't a real threat. He's just a man who thinks he's smarter than he is. James's brows lifted. And Patrick? Edward's jaw clenched. He's just the idiot Davenport planned to use. He looked at Carter. I want eyes on Patrick. If Davenport was willing to come here and talk, that means he's sure Patrick won't turn on him. That means Patrick doesn't even realize how deep he is. Carter nodded. And Davenport? Edward's smirk returned, sharp and unforgiving. Davenport made the mistake of showing his hand too early. Now I get to destroy him. James exhaled. You sure you don't want to take him out the easy way? Edward chuckled. No, I want him to watch. He turned to the window, staring out over the city. Davenport thought he had won. He thought he had Edward cornered. But Edward Sinclair wasn't someone who played by the rules. And by the time he was done, Davenport would regret ever thinking he could take his throne. Edward had played the game long enough to know when someone was bluffing. Richard Davenport thought he had won. He believed he had backed Edward into a corner, left him with no choice but to fold. But Edward wasn't a man who folded. He was a man who destroyed. The night air was crisp as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking over the city he had conquered. The skyline was beautiful, but tonight it felt different, tainted. Somewhere in those streets, Davenport was celebrating, believing he had outmaneuvered him. Patrick was probably too stupid to realize how deep he had been played, and whoever else was involved in this, they were waiting, watching. Edward wasn't going to let them wait much longer. James and Carter stood behind him, their expressions tense but ready. They knew better than to question his silence. He was thinking, calculating, planning his next move. James was the first to speak. "So what's the next step?" Edward took a slow breath, his voice measured. "We don't go after Davenport yet." "He's expecting that." Carter nodded. "You want to smoke out whoever else is involved." Edward turned, facing them. "Exactly. Davenport's confident, which means he thinks he's protected. But that protection comes from whoever else is backing him. That's who we need to find." James crossed his arms. "And how do we do that?" Edward's smirk was slow, calculated. "We make them come to us." The plan was set in motion within hours. By morning, a controlled leak of information spread through the right channels. Edward Sinclair was pulling out of a major expansion deal. The news hit the financial circuits fast. It was a strategic move, one designed to shake the people who had bet against him. If someone was waiting for his empire to weaken, this would make them think they were finally winning. By the afternoon, Edward had already received 3 separate inquiries from investors who suddenly wanted meetings. Some were genuine, others were probing, trying to get a read on whether he was really on the decline. But the most interesting call came from Patrick. Edward answered on the 3rd ring, his tone cool. "Patrick." There was a hesitation on the other end, and then Patrick's voice came through, trying to sound casual, but Edward could hear the tension beneath it. "Heard you're making some interesting business decisions." Edward leaned against his desk, watching the city below. "You've been keeping up with the market? Now that's new." Patrick scoffed. "Come on, Edward. We don't have to pretend. I know what's going on." Edward let the silence stretch, waiting. Patrick continued, trying to sound in control, but Edward could hear the uncertainty. "You're making moves because you know it's over. You can't fight this. You're done." Edward smirked. There it was. Patrick wanted to believe he had won, but he was still looking for reassurance. That meant he wasn't as sure as Davenport had led him to believe. "Is that what they told you?" Edward asked, his voice smooth. Patrick hesitated. "They didn't have to tell me anything. You think I don't see it? You've lost control." Edward chuckled softly, the sound cold. "If I lost control, Patrick, the first wouldn't still be here." There was a beat of silence before Patrick spoke again, this time with something almost like doubt in his voice. "You should take the deal, Edward. Step down. Walk away before it gets worse." Edward's grip on his phone tightened. So that was it. They were feeding Patrick the same line. Davenport had tried to sell him. That meant Patrick was being used as the messenger, the fool they sent in to try and get Edward to concede. Edward let out a breath, slow and deliberate. "Tell me something, Patrick. Do you actually believe you're in control? That Davenport gives a damn about you?" Patrick bristled. "I don't need him to. This isn't just about me. This is about all the people you screwed over." Edward's smirk widened. "Oh, I see. So now you're some kind of martyr, doing this for the greater good?" Patrick's silence was telling. Edward continued, his voice dropping to something darker. "You don't even realize what's happening, do you? They're using you. They've been using you since the beginning. You think they're letting you win, but the second they don't need you anymore, you're gone." Patrick let out a nervous chuckle, but there was a crack in his confidence now. "You always think you're the smartest guy in the room, don't you?" Edward's voice was calm, final. "No, Patrick. I just know when I'm playing against idiots." He ended the call before Patrick could respond. James let out a low whistle. That went well. Edward exhaled, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Patrick's in deeper than I thought, but he's still unsure." Carter leaned forward. "You think he'll break?" Edward's smirk returned, sharp and deadly. "Not yet, but soon." They had just finished debriefing when Julia entered the office, looking uneasy. "Mr. Sinclair, there's someone here to see you." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Julia hesitated. She wouldn't give a name, just said it was urgent. Edward exchanged a glance with James before nodding. "Send her in." A moment later, the door opened, and Stella Kensington stepped inside. Edward hadn't seen her since the night at the Lexington, since she had saved his life. But now, standing in his office, she looked different, more guarded, more aware of the storm that had started swirling around her. She met his gaze, unwavering. "We need to talk." Edward gestured to the seat across from him. "Go ahead." She sat, taking a slow breath before speaking. "I think I know who erased the security footage at the Lexington." Edward stilled. Stella's voice was steady, certain. It wasn't just someone covering tracks, it was someone inside. Edward leaned forward, intrigued. "And you know this how?" Stella exhaled. "Because I saw something that night. Something I didn't think much of at the time, but now it makes sense. Edward's pulse quickened. Stella met his gaze. I think you have a mole. The room was silent for a moment before Edward spoke, his voice cold and controlled. Then let's find out who they are. And just like that, the war turned in his favor. Edward studied Stella carefully, his mind already calculating a dozen different possibilities. She sat across from him, her posture tense but steady, her gaze unwavering. He had underestimated her once, seeing her only as the waitress who had spilled wine on him. Now she was proving to be far more valuable than he had anticipated. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. Tell me everything. Stella inhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. That night at the Lexington, after I knocked over your wine, everything happened fast. Security was running after the guy who poisoned your drink. People were panicking. But in the middle of all of that, I noticed something strange. Edward said nothing, waiting. There was a man near the security office. I barely glanced at him at first, but then I realized he wasn't panicked like everyone else. He was calm, too calm. James, who had been listening silently, frowned. Describe him. Stella shook her head. I didn't get a good look at his face. He was wearing a staff uniform, but I'd never seen him before. And here's the part that stuck with me. He walked into the security room, stayed for less than 2 minutes, and then left through the back. Right after that, your security footage was wiped. Edward exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening like a blade. Someone inside his own system had cleared the evidence. That meant the leak was closer than he had assumed. Carter straightened. You're sure he wasn't just a regular employee? Stella's expression was firm. No one was supposed to be in the security room except for your team, and I know most of the staff at the Lexington. I've never seen him before. Edward exchanged a glance with James, who was already scrolling through his phone. I'll pull up the employee records from that night, James said. See if anyone was where they shouldn't be. Edward turned his attention back to Stella. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? She hesitated for just a moment. Because I wasn't sure it mattered. I thought you had your own people handling it. But after what happened with Roger Mills, I realized someone's trying to clean up every loose end. If I noticed that guy, maybe he noticed me too. Edward narrowed his eyes. You think you're a target? She let out a humorless chuckle. I don't know, but I do know I don't want to end up like Mills. Edward studied her for a long moment. She had gotten involved in something she had no business being part of, but instead of running, she was sitting here, helping him put the pieces together. From now on, he said, his voice calm but firm, you don't go anywhere alone. He glanced at Carter. Assign someone to keep an eye on her. Stella's eyes flickered with something close to annoyance. I don't need a babysitter, Edward smirked. That's not up for discussion. Before she could argue, James let out a low curse. Got something. He turned his phone toward Edward and Carter, showing them a list of names. These are the security logs from the Lexington the night of the poisoning. Every employee is accounted for, except for one. Edward's gaze sharpened. Who? James's expression was grim. Jeremy Foster. He was listed as part of the kitchen staff, but according to payroll, he was never actually scheduled that night. No one remembers hiring him, and here's the kicker, he hasn't shown up for work since. Carter crossed his arms. A ghost employee. Classic setup. He was planted there. Edward's jaw clenched. And now he's gone. Stella's voice was quieter but firm. Then that means someone else is still inside. Edward's mind raced. Whoever had orchestrated this had more than one piece on the board. Jeremy Foster had been the one who wiped the footage, but he hadn't acted alone. Someone had gotten him in, given him access. And if that person was still around, they were watching every move Edward made. His phone buzzed. A new text. Unknown number. You're looking in the wrong places, but keep going. It's entertaining. Edward's grip tightened around the phone. His enemy wasn't just watching, they were enjoying this. James leaned forward. That another warning? Edward let out a slow exhale. No, that's a challenge. For the first time in years, someone had put Edward in a position where he was forced to react instead of control, and whoever was behind this, they were having fun with it. Carter's voice cut through the tension. We need to find Foster before he disappears completely. Edward nodded. Do it. And start running background checks on every single staff member at the Lexington. If someone helped him get in, I want to know who. James stood, already dialing numbers. Stella hesitated before speaking. And what about me? Edward turned to her, his expression unreadable. You stay close. If someone's been watching, They might come after you next." She exhaled, then gave a small nod. "Fine, but if I get shot or kidnapped, I'm blaming you." Edward smirked. "Noted." As the team moved into action, Edward walked to the window, staring out over the city. The war had officially shifted. They thought they had him on defense. They were wrong. Edward Sinclair had never been a man who played fair. And now he was about to show them why no one survived going against him. Edward didn't believe in luck. He believed in strategy, in leverage, in control. Luck was for the weak, for those who had no power over their own fate. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt like he was the one being hunted. That wasn't something he was willing to tolerate. Jeremy Foster, a ghost employee, a man who shouldn't have been there but had been given access anyway. That meant someone inside his world had let him in. Someone who thought they were untouchable. He was about to prove them wrong. James had been on the phone for over an hour, working contacts, digging through every possible lead to find out where Foster had gone. Carter had his team scrubbing through every security system in the city. But so far, they had nothing. Foster had vanished, and that wasn't an accident. Stella sat across from him in the office, arms crossed, watching the storm gather behind his eyes. "You're pissed." Edward glanced at her, arching an eyebrow. "You have a talent for stating the obvious." She shrugged. "Maybe, but you're used to having all the answers. This isn't something you can just fix by throwing money at it, is it?" Edward smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Everything has a price. Everyone has a weakness." He leaned forward. "And I'll find his." Before Stella could reply, James let out a low curse from across the room. "Got something." Edward and Stella were on their feet in seconds. James turned his laptop toward them, the screen displaying a series of transactions. Foster's name is nowhere in the system, which means he was paid under the table. But I traced an unusual financial movement. Through the Lexington's payroll, someone approved a payment to an unregistered contractor a week before the poisoning attempt. Edward's eyes narrowed. "Who?" James hesitated. "You're not going to like it." Edward's patience was thin. "Say the name." James exhaled. "Michael Reed. Your head of security at the Lexington." The word sent a cold wave through the room. Carter cursed under his breath. "That bastard was right under our noses the whole time." Edward clenched his jaw, processing the betrayal. Michael Reed had been his guy, handpicked, trusted, someone who was supposed to protect his interests. And instead, he had been working against him. Stella was the first to break the silence. "Where is he now?" James shook his head. "That's the problem. He hasn't been seen since this morning. No calls, no financial activity. It's like he disappeared." Edward ran a hand through his hair, forcing himself to think. This wasn't just about money anymore. Reed had been the gatekeeper, the one who let Foster in, but now someone had decided he was no longer useful. He turned to Carter. "Find him. I don't care what it takes." Carter nodded. "On it." Edward's phone buzzed. A new message. "Unknown number. Too slow, Edward. He's already gone." Edward's grip tightened around the phone. Someone was watching his every move, always one step ahead. But not for long. He exhaled slowly, his voice cold. "Get the car ready." James frowned. "Where are we going?" Edward's smirk was sharp, lethal. "If Reed's still alive, he'll go to the only place where he feels safe. And I know exactly where that is." The drive was quiet, the tension thick. Stella sat beside him, in the back seat, her fingers tapping against her knee in an unconscious rhythm. "You haven't told me why you're bringing me along," she finally said. Edward didn't look at her. "Because you saw something I didn't. And right now I can't afford to overlook anything." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Fair enough." They pulled up outside a low-end apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The place was nothing special rundown, dimly lit, the kind of building where people went to disappear. Edward stepped out first, scanning the area. Carter had 2 men stationed outside already, on alert. James checked his phone. "Reed's car's in the lot. He's here." Edward walked toward the door, his movements calm, controlled. He knocked twice. No answer. Then a sound from inside a chair scraping against the floor. Someone moving. Edward exchanged a glance with Carter before stepping back and kicking the door open. The apartment was dark, the air thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and desperation. Michael Reed sat in the middle of the room, a gun in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking. He looked at Edward with something between fear and resignation. Edward didn't flinch. "Put the gun down, Michael. Reed let out a bitter laugh. What's the point? You already know, don't you? Edward took a slow step forward. I know you let Foster in. I know you took money from someone to make sure I didn't see what was coming. Reed swallowed hard. I didn't have a choice. Edward's voice was quiet, deadly. You always have a choice. Reed's grip tightened on the gun. Not when they own you. Silence stretched between them. Stella spoke up, her voice softer than Edward expected. Who owns you, Michael? Reed hesitated. Then finally, his gaze flickered to Edward. You think this is just about you? You think this is just Davenport? You have no idea who you're up against. Edward's patience was razor thin. Then, enlighten me. Reed exhaled, his shoulders slumping. You don't stop them, Edward. You don't fight them. You don't win against them. Edward's smirk was slow, dangerous. That's where you're wrong. Reed let out a breathless laugh. You're too late. They already decided how this ends. And before anyone could stop him, he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the room. For a second, no one moved. Reed slumped forward, dead before he hit the ground. Carter cursed. Stella let out a shaky breath. Edward stared at the lifeless body in front of him, his expression unreadable. James spoke first. Now what? Edward turned, walking toward the door. Now, his voice was calm, steady, lethal. We make them regret ever thinking they could control me. And just like that, the war had turned. The stench of gunpowder still hung in the air. Michael Reed's lifeless body slumped forward in the chair, a thin trail of smoke rising from the bullet wound in his temple. The gun lay loosely in his fingers, his last act of final, desperate attempt to escape whatever hell he had gotten himself into. Edward stood motionless, his gaze locked on the scene in front of him. He had seen men die before, some by his hand, some by their own failures, but this was different. Reed had been a soldier in someone else's war, and when he realized there was no way out, he took the only escape he had left: a message, a warning. But Edward wasn't the kind of man who backed down from warnings. James let out a slow exhale. Well, that's inconvenient. Carter muttered a curse under his breath. We needed him alive. Stella, standing a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, finally spoke. He was scared. Edward turned to her, his voice even. Fear makes men sloppy. She met his gaze. Or it makes them realize they've already lost. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Carter stepped forward, nudging the gun away from Reed's fingers with his boot. I'll have my team clean this up. Edward shook his head. No, leave him. James frowned. You want to leave the body here? Edward's expression remained unreadable. Whoever he was afraid of, they'll come looking for him. I want them to find exactly what they left behind: a ghost. James exhaled. All right, but this means we're back to square one. Edward turned to face him, his smirk slow and sharp. No, this means we just cut another one of their strings, because whoever had orchestrated this was running out of puppets. Carter made a few calls, instructing his team to keep watch on the apartment, while Edward walked back toward the car. Stella followed him, her expression unreadable. As they settled into the back seat, she finally spoke. This doesn't end, does it? Edward looked at her, studying her face carefully. She wasn't scared, at least not in the way most people would be. She was aware, which was even more dangerous. No, he said simply. It doesn't. She exhaled, turning to look out the window as the city lights blurred past. Then what happens next? Edward checked his phone. No new messages, no more taunts. Whoever was playing this game had just lost a piece, and now they were waiting for his move. He tucked the phone away, leaning back into the seat. Now, he murmured, we make them show their face. By the time they reached his penthouse, it was past midnight. The city outside was still alive, but in here, there was only silence. Carter and James stayed behind to coordinate surveillance, leaving Edward alone with Stella. She followed him inside, but the moment the door shut, she turned to face him. You still haven't answered my question. Edward arched an eyebrow. Which one? She stepped closer. Why are you keeping me here? He smirked, tilting his head slightly. Would you rather I let you walk out alone? Stella scoffed. You think I need protection? Edward's smirk didn't fade. I think you saw something you weren't supposed to, and I think whoever's behind this knows that. Her jaw tightened. So that's it? I'm a liability? Edward took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. You're an inconvenience to them, which means you're an advantage to me. She let out a humorless chuckle. So I'm just another chess piece. Edward's expression remained calm, but there was something else in his eyes, Something darker. No, Stella. You're the one thing they didn't account for. She studied him for a long moment before exhaling. And what about you? Are you ever afraid? Edward's smirk was slow. Fear is just another tool. You learn how to use it, or you let it destroy you. Stella's gaze didn't waver. And which one are you doing right now? Edward didn't answer. Instead, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another taunt, another faceless threat. But what he saw made his blood run cold. A single photo. His mother sitting at her usual table at a luxury restaurant across town, oblivious to the camera. And beneath it, a message. You're not the only one with something to lose. For the first time since this war had begun, Edward felt true anger. Whoever they were, they had just crossed a line. Stella must have seen the shift in his expression because she stepped forward, eyes narrowing. What is it? Edward turned the phone toward her, letting her read the message. Her face paled slightly. They're going after your family now? Edward's grip tightened around the phone. No. They're trying to control me. But they had underestimated him. He wasn't the kind of man you threatened. He wasn't the kind of man you cornered. He was the kind of man who burned everything down until there was no one left to fight back. He looked up at Stella, his voice quiet but lethal. Get ready. For what? She asked. Edward's smirk was razor sharp. For me to remind them why they should have killed me when they had the chance. Because now he wasn't going to stop until he had torn their world apart. Edward Sinclair had spent years building an empire, making sure no one could ever touch him. But now, someone had reached into his life, into his family, and sent him a message written in veiled threats and quiet violence. They thought they could control him. They thought they could scare him. They were about to find out just how badly they had miscalculated. The drive to the restaurant was fast, silent. James was behind the wheel, his expression grim, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Carter sat in the front seat, already checking on security. Stella was next to Edward in the back, her gaze flicking between him and the city outside, as if she was waiting for him to explode. But Edward didn't explode. He calculated. His mother, Eleanor Sinclair, wasn't a fool. She had built this family alongside his father, shaping its power in ways no one ever acknowledged. But she was also not a target. Whoever had sent that message had just made an unforgivable mistake. James spoke first, his voice low. We have security sweeping the area. No unusual activity so far. Whoever took that photo did it fast and clean. Edward didn't respond, his gaze locked on the passing streets. He was already thinking ahead. Whoever they were close. Too close. Carter's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then turned slightly. She's still inside. No sign of anyone approaching her. Edward exhaled slowly. Then let's keep it that way. The moment the car stopped in front of the restaurant, two of Edward's security guards stepped forward, flanking the entrance. He pushed the door open and walked inside, his movements calm, controlled, but his presence demanded attention. The restaurant was full of the city's elite men and women who thrived on wealth and power, people who had spent their lives trying to reach the level Edward had long surpassed. Conversation slowed as he walked past, some eyes turning toward him with curiosity, others with quiet fear, but Edward wasn't looking at them. His gaze went straight to the back of the room, where his mother sat at her usual table, an untouched glass of wine in front of her. She looked up the moment he approached, her sharp blue eyes scanning his face. She knew. Eleanor Sinclair had always known when something was wrong. Edward, she greeted, voice even. I wasn't expecting you. Edward pulled out the chair across from her, sitting down. James and Carter took positions nearby, watching the room. Stella lingered a few steps back, unsure if she should be here. Edward didn't waste time. He placed his phone on the table, the photo facing Eleanor. Who sent this? He asked. She looked at it for a long moment before sighing, lifting the glass of wine but not drinking. So it's finally happening. Edward's jaw tightened. You knew? Eleanor's gaze met his, unwavering. I knew someone would come for you eventually. You don't build what you've built without making enemies, Edward. I just didn't think they'd be this reckless. He leaned forward slightly. Who do they answer to? She let out a quiet chuckle. If I knew that, I would have handled it myself. Edward clenched his fists. You're leaving something out. Eleanor studied him for a moment, before placing her glass down. Richard Davenport isn't your real enemy. He's a distraction. You already know that. But the people behind him, they're older than him, more powerful than him. and they've been waiting for the right moment to move against you." Edward exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about something bigger, something older. Then, before he could speak, a single gunshot shattered the air. Glass exploded. People screamed. Edward's body moved on instinct, grabbing Eleanor and shoving her to the ground. James and Carter were already pulling weapons, scanning the restaurant. Stella had hit the floor behind a table, eyes wide. Edward's ears were ringing. The shot had come from outside. He turned his head, catching a glimpse of the shattered window where Eleanor had been sitting just seconds before. A warning shot. They could have killed her. They wanted him to know that. Carter's voice was sharp, controlled. Shooter's already gone. Edward's pulse was steady. His mind was already ahead. He stood slowly, helping Eleanor up. She was shaken but not afraid. She had spent her life around men like this, men who thought fear was a currency they could trade. Edward turned to James. "Lock this place down. Get her somewhere safe." Eleanor straightened her jacket. "Don't you dare put me in a safe house, Edward." His gaze flickered toward her. "You don't get a say in this." She lifted her chin, eyes narrowing. "Don't treat me like some fragile thing you need to protect." Edward exhaled sharply. "They took a shot at you, Mother." She arched an eyebrow. "And they missed." Despite everything, Edward smirked. Of course she wasn't scared. Stella stepped forward now, cautious. "This wasn't just a warning, was it?" Edward shook his head. "No, this was an invitation." James frowned. "Invitation to what?" Edward's smirk turned cold, sharp as a blade. To the end game. This was no longer about threats, no longer about warnings. Whoever was behind this had shown their hand, and now Edward was about to tear them apart piece by piece. His enemies had made the mistake of thinking they could control him. They were about to learn that Edward Sinclair didn't play by anyone's rules but his own. And when this was over, they wouldn't have anything left to hide behind. Edward Sinclair had spent his life mastering control. Every deal, every move, every decision was calculated to maintain his dominance. But tonight, the rules had changed. Someone had crossed the line. They had threatened his mother. That wasn't just a mistake, it was an execution order. The ride to their next destination was suffocating with tension. James drove like a man with a mission, weaving through the city at speeds that blurred the streetlights into golden streaks. Carter sat in the passenger seat, fingers tapping against his knee, his phone held loosely in his other hand as he issued orders to their security teams. In the back seat, Edward sat still, his face unreadable. Beside him, Stella stole a glance at him, her arms crossed over her chest. She could feel the storm inside him, even if he didn't show it. His silence was more terrifying than rage. She finally spoke. "You're going to kill him, aren't you?" Edward didn't turn to her. His voice was calm. "Not yet." Stella scoffed. "So what? You're just going to scare him?" Edward's smirk was slow, dangerous. "No, Stella. I'm going to break him." Silence stretched between them. James finally spoke from the front seat. "Davenport's got eyes everywhere. He'll know we're coming." Edward leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Good. Because tonight, Davenport wasn't the one setting the trap." The car screeched to a halt outside an exclusive private club. One of Davenport's favorite places, the kind of place where power brokers and corporate kings gathered behind closed doors, sipping whiskey, as they whispered secrets, and carved up the world like a meal. Edward stepped out first, the crisp night air doing nothing to cool the fire burning in his veins. James and Carter flanked him, their eyes scanning the street. They weren't expecting an ambush. Davenport wasn't that sloppy, but he was arrogant, and arrogance made men reckless. The doormen hesitated when they saw Edward approaching, but they didn't dare stop him. No one stopped Edward Sinclair. Inside, the club was a sea of hushed conversations, the smell of expensive cigars and aged scotch thick in the air. Men in tailored suits sat in darkened booths, discussing deals worth billions. But when Edward walked in, the room shifted. Conversations faltered. Eyes flickered toward him, some curious, others cautious. A few men looked away entirely, pretending they hadn't noticed him at all. They knew. Everyone in this world knew what had happened tonight. And at the far end of the room, in a booth bathed in dim amber light, Richard Davenport was waiting. He was sipping a glass of Macallan, his smirk lazy, exuding false confidence. He had been expecting this. Edward stopped in front of him, his stance calm but commanding. Richard Davenport smiled, setting his glass down. "Edward, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Edward didn't bother sitting. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "You sent someone after my mother." Davenport's smirk didn't waver, but Edward saw it, the slight twitch in his fingers, the subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty. "I don't know what you're talking about," Davenport said smoothly. Edward tilted his head. "Lying to me isn't a good strategy." Davenport chuckled, shaking his head. "Edward, let's be realistic. Do you really think I'd be stupid enough to go after your family?" Edward didn't blink. "Yes." Davenport's smirk faltered for the briefest second. Edward took another step forward, his presence towering. "Let's get something straight. You don't touch my family. You don't send cowards with guns to deliver messages. If you have something to say, you say it to my face." Davenport's fingers curled around his glass. "I don't respond well to threats." Edward smiled. "Who said I was threatening you?" Before Davenport could react, Edward grabbed him by the collar and yanked him forward, slamming him against the table with enough force to make the glass spill. The club fell into absolute silence. Gasps rippled through the room, but no one moved, no one intervened. Davenport let out a strangled gasp, his hands gripping Edward's wrist. "Edward!" Edward leaned in, his voice lethal. "You think you can hide behind your friends in the dark? You think I don't know who's pulling your strings?" Davenport struggled, his bravado cracking. "This isn't." Edward slammed him down again, rattling the table. "You made the wrong move." Davenport's face reddened, panic flickering in his eyes. "You can't just—" Edward released him suddenly, letting him collapse back into the booth, gasping. Carter and James stood nearby, watching the room. No one dared move. Edward straightened his suit, adjusting his cuffs. "Consider this your only warning." Davenport wiped a shaking hand across his mouth, trying to recover. "You think you can intimidate me?" Edward's smirk was razor sharp. "No, Richard. I think you're already terrified." Davenport swallowed hard. "This is going to come back on you." Edward exhaled, shaking his head. "No, Richard. This is going to come down on you. And when it does," he leaned in slightly, "no one will remember you." He turned and walked away, the room still holding its collective breath. James and Carter followed him out, the weight of his presence lingering in the air like a warning no one would forget. As soon as they stepped outside, Carter let out a low whistle. That was a hell of a message. Edward checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "Now we wait." Stella, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Wait for what?" Edward's smirk returned, cold and lethal. "For Davenport to start running, because now the hunt had truly begun." Edward Sinclair had spent his life hunting men like Richard Davenport, the type that wore expensive suits and hid behind money, connections, and false power. But power was only real when it couldn't be taken away, and tonight, Edward had started taking everything from him. Davenport wouldn't sleep tonight. He wouldn't sit in his comfortable office, sipping his overpriced scotch, believing himself untouchable. No, he would be waiting, watching his phone, expecting something worse. And that was exactly what Edward wanted. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows of the car as James drove in silence. Carter was still on his phone, coordinating security, tightening the noose. Every one of Davenport's businesses, his assets, his contacts, they were being squeezed. It was only a matter of time before something cracked. Stella sat next to Edward, watching him carefully. She had seen him angry before, but this was different. Finally she spoke. "So what now?" Edward didn't take his eyes off the city. "Now we let him feel the pressure." Stella frowned. "And then what? He fights back?" Edward smirked. "No, he makes a mistake. Because men like Davenport weren't built for war. They played their games behind desks, surrounded by lawyers and accountants who did their dirty work for them. But this wasn't a boardroom fight anymore. This was survival." James glanced at Edward through the rearview mirror. "You think he'll run?" Edward exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "He'll try, but he won't get far." Carter finally put his phone down. "We just got a hit on his movements after we left the club. He made a call, then another, and then another." He smirked. Davenport's panicking. Edward's smirk widened. "Good. Who's he calling?" Carter pulled up the records. Some of his usual contacts, but here's where it gets interesting. He made 2 calls to an unregistered burner number. "We're tracing it now." Edward's fingers tapped against the armrest, mind racing. A burner phone meant only one thing. Davenport wasn't calling for favors. He was calling for help, or for an escape route. James's phone buzzed, and he checked the screen before letting out a quiet curse. "We got him. Davenport just booked a one-way flight out of the country. Private jet leaves in 3 hours." Silence settled in the car for a moment. Edward chuckled, shaking his head. So predictable. Carter's expression hardened. You want us to stop him at the airport? Edward smirked. No. Let him get on the plane. Stella blinked. What? Edward turned to her, his voice calm, cold. You don't kill the animal while it's still in its cage. You let it think it's free. You let it run. And then, his smirk deepened. You bring it down where everyone can see. The next few hours moved like a carefully planned symphony. Every piece fell into place. Every move anticipated. Edward had Carter's men watching every step Davenport took. The security footage from the airport was streamed directly to them, showing Davenport's tense posture, his hurried steps. He was running. He thought he was getting away. Edward sipped a glass of whiskey, watching the screen from his penthouse. Stella stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. You really think this is going to work? Edward chuckled. It's already working, because there was one thing men like Davenport never understood. Power wasn't about money. It wasn't about connections. It was about control, and right now, Edward controlled everything. James leaned against the bar, checking his phone. Davenport just boarded. Plane is taxiing now. Edward nodded. Good. Carter's voice was calm. And here comes the fun part. A moment later, the screen flickered, switching from airport security footage to a live broadcast from a major news network. The anchor was speaking rapidly, her voice filled with urgency. Breaking news: high-profile financial investor under investigation for fraud, money laundering, and illegal political bribery. Davenport's name flashed across the screen. His entire empire was being exposed in real time. The camera cut to a shot of the airport runway, where federal agents were already moving, and then the plane stopped. Stella's breath caught. Oh my God. James chuckled. And there it is. On the screen, the airport security team surrounded the aircraft. Minutes later, Richard Davenport was being dragged off the plane in handcuffs. His face was pale, his body stiff with shock and rage. Edward exhaled, setting his drink down. Told you he'd make a mistake. Stella turned to him, eyes wide. You set him up, Edward smirked. No, Stella. He set himself up, because all it had taken was a few leaked documents, a nudge to the right authorities, and now Davenport was finished. James laughed. Damn, that was clean. Carter shook his head, impressed. And now? Edward exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Now we find out who was really behind him. Because Davenport was never the real threat. He was just another pawn in a much bigger game. And whoever was still hiding in the shadows, they were next. Richard Davenport was finished. The world had watched as he was dragged off his private jet, handcuffed, his face plastered across every major news network. His empire, once built on arrogance and carefully cultivated alliances, was now crumbling in real time. Edward had orchestrated his downfall with precision, knowing that removing Davenport wasn't just about eliminating a rival, it was about forcing the real enemy out of the shadows. Because Davenport had never been the one in control, he had been propped up, funded, and manipulated by someone far more powerful. And now that their pawn had fallen, they were exposed. Edward sat in his penthouse office, fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. The city below glittered with artificial light, but his mind was focused on a much darker game, a bigger game. James stood near the monitors, scanning information as Carter paced beside him, phone in hand, coordinating with their teams. Stella leaned against the bar, watching Edward closely. You don't look like a man who just won, she finally said. Edward smirked, his eyes still locked on the skyline. That's because I haven't, she frowned. Davenport is done. His businesses are frozen. His accounts are being investigated, and everyone he ever worked with is jumping ship. She tilted her head. What else is left? Edward exhaled, standing up. Davenport was a distraction. The real threat has been operating behind him, using him as a shield. And now, he smirked, now they have to make a move. Carter let out a breath. And we're watching for it. James looked up from his screen. We've got something. Edward turned, his expression sharpening. Talk. James tapped a few keys, pulling up financial records. We've been tracking Davenport's last transactions before the arrest. Most of his accounts were frozen immediately, but one got through. Edward stepped forward, studying the data. James continued. A high-value transfer moved offshore. The receiving account is encrypted, but it was linked to a shell company, Vanguard Holdings. Carter's brows furrowed. Vanguard? He exhaled sharply. That's not just any shell company, Edward. That's the kind of name that pops up when countries go to war, not when corporate idiots try to kill each other. Edward already knew that. Vanguard Holdings wasn't just a front, it was a power structure, a network that only the wealthiest and most dangerous people had access to. Governments, billionaires, arms dealers, and now, apparently, his enemies. Stella stepped closer. "So this is bigger than Davenport?" Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "Of course it is." Davenport had been loud and reckless, but the real enemy, they had stayed silent. Until now. James continued scrolling through more data. "That transfer, it's on the move again. Whoever took Davenport's money isn't letting it sit still. They're trying to clean their hands before anyone can follow the trail." Edward's gaze darkened. "Where's it going?" James exhaled, reading the screen. "Zurich." Edward's smirk widened. "Of course it is. Switzerland, one of the most secure financial havens in the world. A place where people with something to hide stashed their wealth, their secrets, and their power." Carter crossed his arms. "You think they're trying to disappear?" Edward shook his head. "No. They're setting up for the next move. You don't run to Zurich unless you have a plan." Stella frowned. "So what do we do?" Edward grabbed his coat, buttoning it with slow precision. "We go to Zurich." James blinked. "You want to fly into one of the most heavily protected banking capitals in the world just to chase this down?" Edward smirked. "No, James. I want to end this." Carter exhaled, already making calls. "I'll get the jet ready." Stella, however, was watching him carefully. "And what if it's a trap?" Edward turned to her, his voice dangerously calm. "Oh, it definitely is. That was the whole point. If his enemies wanted to set a trap, they had just made one fatal mistake. They thought he was the prey. They were about to find out he was the hunter." The flight to Zurich was silent, but not calm. It was the kind of silence that carried anticipation, tension, and inevitability. The private jet cut through the night sky, the hum of the engines the only sound as Edward sat at the head of the cabin, his mind working through the possibilities. Stella sat across from him, arms crossed. She hadn't questioned coming along, not after everything she had already seen. James was on his laptop, finalizing their contacts in Zurich. "I pulled every thread I could, but whoever's behind this, they don't exist on paper. Don't leave trails." Edward smirked. "Everyone leaves a trail. You just have to know where to look." Carter was loading his sidearm. "So we walk into one of the most secured financial districts on the planet. And then what?" Edward's voice was ice. "We make them show themselves." Because whoever had been orchestrating this war from the shadows had just forced Edward to step onto their battlefield. But what they didn't realize, Edward Sinclair never stepped onto anyone else's battlefield. He burned it down and built his own. By the time they landed, the plan was already in motion. Zurich was cold, the air crisp as they stepped onto the tarmac. A black SUV was waiting, courtesy of an old contact with no loyalty but a lot of debts. James checked his watch. "The money landed 2 hours ago. They're here." Edward's smirk deepened, then let the games begin. Zurich was quiet, but not in the way that made people feel at ease. It was the kind of quiet built on wealth, power, and secrecy. The kind that kept wars from spilling into the open, where fortunes were made and erased with the press of a button. Edward Sinclair had never belonged in a city like this. He didn't hide his power in ledgers and private accounts. He wielded it. But tonight, Zurich belonged to him. The black SUV moved through the dimly lit streets, cutting through the heart of the financial district. James was in the front, tapping on his tablet, tracking every digital movement in real time. Carter sat beside him, his fingers twitching near the firearm holstered under his jacket. In the back, Edward sat still, watching the city pass by, his mind moving faster than the vehicle. Stella sat beside him, arms crossed, her gaze flickering between him and the world outside. She wasn't used to this, not entirely, but she wasn't running either. She finally broke the silence. "Tell me how this ends." Edward didn't look at her, with me walking away. She studied him, reading between the words. "And them?" Edward exhaled, slow and controlled. "They won't." Stella swallowed but didn't say anything else. She understood now. James cleared his throat. "We have movement." He turned the tablet so Edward could see the map. The money-hidden account registered to an office downtown. Small, private, no visible ties to any major firms. He zoomed in. "But here's the interesting part. It's owned by a shell company linked to Vanguard Holdings. And it just activated for the first time in 5 years." Edward smirked. They were getting sloppy. Carter exhaled. "So, they're either waiting for us or running." Edward's voice was cold. They don't get to run. The SUV pulled up outside a modern glass building, the kind designed to blend in, to look harmless. But nothing in Zurich was harmless. Edward stepped out first, buttoning his coat as he walked toward the entrance. James, Carter, and Stella followed. A receptionist behind a sleek white desk looked up, her polite expression faltering. The moment her gaze met Edward's, she knew. Edward didn't wait. "We have an appointment." Her hands hesitated over the keyboard. "With whom?" Edward's smirk didn't waver. "Tell your boss I'm here to collect." A tense pause. Then the woman nodded and pressed a discreet button under the desk. Within moments, a door at the end of the lobby clicked open. Edward led the way, his steps steady, controlled. The corridor was dimly lit, lined with floor-to-ceiling glass panels that revealed empty offices, as if the place had been abandoned just before they arrived. At the end of the hallway, a single figure waited, a man in a dark suit, perfectly tailored, his silver hair slicked back, his posture relaxed in a way that only men who never feared consequences could manage. Edward stopped a few feet away. "I was wondering when we'd finally meet." The man smiled. "Edward Sinclair. You've been very persistent." Edward smirked. "It's a bad habit." The man exhaled, stepping forward. "Call me Reinhardt," James muttered under his breath, recognizing the name. Reinhardt Kessler, a financial ghost, a man who existed only in whispers and transactions that never left a paper trail. Edward wasn't impressed. Reinhardt studied him. "You should be celebrating. You won. Davenport is finished." Edward's smirk never wavered. Davenport was never the target. Reinhardt chuckled. "Of course not. You're a man who sees the board, not just the pieces." He clasped his hands behind his back. "But that's what makes you so dangerous." Edward tilted his head slightly. "You sound concerned." Reinhardt sighed, shaking his head. "No, Mr. Sinclair. I'm disappointed." Stella frowned. "In what?" Reinhardt met Edward's gaze. "In you." Edward arched an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Reinhardt exhaled, stepping closer. "You have all the makings of a man who could have ruled this world properly. You understand power, strategy, loyalty. You could have joined us." Edward's smirk faded slightly. "You tried to kill me." Reinhardt's smile was thin, calculating. "If I had tried to kill you, Mr. Sinclair, you wouldn't be standing here." Silence thickened between them. Edward exhaled. "You backed the wrong man." Reinhardt nodded. "Perhaps. But Davenport was never meant to win." He studied Edward carefully. "He was meant to distract you." James tensed. "He's stalling." Edward's pulse remained steady. "For what?" And then, as if on cue, the building shook a low rumble, followed by a distant explosion. Carter cursed. "That was the damn parking garage." Reinhardt smirked. "Insurance, Mr. Sinclair. I can't have you walking out of here easily." Edward exhaled slowly. "You really think this changes anything?" Reinhardt tilted his head. "Not at all. But it's a reminder even men like you can't control everything." Edward took a step forward, voice low. "Watch me." And then he moved faster than Reinhardt expected, a single punch to the throat, cutting off whatever smug remark was about to follow. Reinhardt stumbled back, choking, before Edward grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the glass wall. The entire panel cracked under the force. Reinhardt gasped for air, his confident mask finally slipping. Edward leaned in, his voice a whisper of cold certainty. "Tell me, Reinhardt, when was the last time someone scared you?" The older man's fingers clawed at Edward's wrist, but Edward didn't let go. "I don't need to control everything," Edward murmured. "Just you." And then a gunshot, not from Carter, not from James, but from Stella. She had pulled the trigger without hesitation, hitting the security guard behind them before he could fire first. The body hit the ground with a dull thud. Edward smirked. "Good aim." Stella exhaled. "I wasn't going to wait for him to shoot me first." Edward turned back to Reinhardt, who was finally regaining his breath. "Now," Edward murmured, "let's talk about how this ends." Because Zurich wasn't the end game, it was just the beginning.